Great. Thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. This is our first ever conversation on artificial intelligence, where we're actually bringing together labor, the private sector, and the legislature. So this is a really significant moment. And I just wanted to thank you all for spending the time today to meet with us, to talk through especially AI's impact on the economy and our workforce at a moment where it's really pivotal for all of us, right? And really important to be proactive instead of reactive in our approach. So I am Senator Kristen Gonzalez. I chair Internet and Technology. So I appreciate, again, you all being here. We have an incredible panel of experts. So I was just going to do some quick introductions of all of you so that the folks tuning in or viewing virtually will, know a little bit more about all of you and the work you do. And then I'm going to turn it to all of you to talk about what you care about, what brought you here today, and just what your engagement with, I guess, this new generation of artificial intelligence has meant to you. So with that, I'm going to start to my right with Senator Hinchey, who represents the 41st Senate District, which includes Columbia and Greene counties, Northern Dutchess, and portions of Ulster County. Senator Hinchey is a leading voice on environmental and labor issues in the legislature and in the upstate region. I'm going to then go to her right, to Joanna Pena-Bickley, who's the founder of the AI Design Corps, a nonprofit that focuses on the design of technology education for marginalized groups and young women. Joanna has been involved with the design of a number of groundbreaking technology products. Then we have Mike Neidl, who's the legislative director for the New York State chapter of the AFL-CIO. The AFL-CIO is the largest federation of unions in the US, representing 60 national and international labor unions and more than 12.5 million working people. We're also joined by Chris Ford, who is the council leader for Division 357 of the Public Employees Federation, a union that represents 50,000 public employees in the state of New York. Christopher is also an employee of the Office of Information Technology Services, giving him unique insight into the intersection of AI and state government. And last in person, but certainly not least, we have Assemblymember Grace Lee, who represents the 65th Assembly District in Lower Manhattan, covering parts of Soho, Chinatown, and the Lower East Side. Assemblymember Lee is a respected community leader and small business owner who stands up for the rights of marginalized individuals in her district and beyond. And virtually, we also have a couple of great panelists, including Andrew, who is the founder of Civic Hall, an educational and collaborative work center in New York City that includes a digital skills training center for underserved communities. Andrew has worked at the intersection of technology and government for many years. And next, Pamela Mishkin, a native New Yorker currently living in the 26th State Senate District. She leads the Economics Impact Research Team at OpenAI, and she previously led the deployment planning process for DALL-E 2 and worked on general human AI safety research. Incredible bios from all of you. And again, excited because there's a wealth of knowledge and expertise. So I'm just going to open it up. This is more, again, it's the first conversation that we're having, and we want to keep it more informal. We want to make sure it's a conversation. So feel free to respond to each other. But I want to open it up to all of you to talk a little bit more again about what brought you here and why this is top of mind. So maybe we can go around the table, and not to keep putting Senator Hinchey on the spot, but start with Senator Hinchey, and then we can get into more of a conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you. First and foremost, thank you, Senator Gonzalez, for your leadership and for hosting this roundtable today and for really diving into this space. I think something that we're probably, not to speak for everyone, but probably all aligned on is there are some really exciting opportunities in AI, especially around education, in so many facets, and yet there are some really concerning areas as well, and some deep challenges. And if we don't have these conversations early, if we don't put parameters on this new technology, we're going to be looking backwards like we are today with social media and so many other types of technological advancements where we're trying to put the genie back in the bottle and it's just too difficult. And so I can talk a little bit about a bill that we're doing later on as we kind of get into it. But for me, in talking with peers of mine out in the private sector, folks who are really diving into the AI space, it became really clear to me that in some of the work that they're doing, there's not just the potential, but the actuality that we are going to see the elimination of almost 2/3 of the job market, including entry-level jobs, middle management jobs, and some senior management jobs. And if we are kind of recognizing that future and seeing that that could happen, not only are we setting ourselves up for a path back to an oligarchical society, but we are actually going to be facing obviously severe economic impacts, not just to the state, but to the country. And so making sure that we're having that lens and that we as government are working with our partners in labor and the private sector to do what's right, both for the advancement of new technologies, but making sure we're protecting the workforce now.
Yeah, amazing. And then, Joanna, you want to make your way this way?
Sure. Well, I'm here kind of with two hats today. As the former head of R&D for Alexa devices, I understand the need and the focus that we need to discuss on privacy and data. Because I think that often the conversations that we're having is far more about the algorithm as opposed to the thing that we actually need protection from at a citizenry. So I think from that perspective, I think it's super important. From a workforce perspective, I lead a non-for-profit called the AI Design Corps, and we focus. While we've had a focus in schools, we're actually also focused on everything from mid to long-term career iterative learning. And the reason for that is because the statistics you're talking about, I would tell you have 1 to 3 years before we hit a 50% mark that we need to upskill. If we were just looking at New York State, 50% of our workforce. And I think today there's a lot of misnomer that we're looking at just white collar jobs, when in fact, if you combine automation, particularly in the area of food service, Steve Krill's place down, the former CEO of Chipotle is a really good example of this, right? Robotic hamburger making already in your district. So when you start to take a look at the emergence here, what you're going to begin seeing, particularly I would say in New York City, is a real need to have non-traditional paths to AI literacy almost immediately. You have 1 to 3 years in terms of a 50% marker in some of the core things I think that hit us in the city.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for putting this together today. We really appreciate being invited and be a part of this. I'll just start by saying we're all kind of wrapping our heads around this. Senator Hinchey made a great point that we can't wait for this to happen and then look back and say, here's what we should have done. The impacts on the workforce are tremendous. And you just made a great point. It's affecting everybody. There's blue collar, there's white collar. We've seen it in arts and entertainment. We're seeing it in healthcare, transportation, across the board. We're here today to talk not just about the potential for job loss and making sure we are preparing for that, getting skills to workers who need skills to adapt to the new technology, and just be cognizant, particularly where the state is funding the development of these programs. We want to make sure we're not funding jobs to move away or get replaced by AI, but also more and more we're seeing AI in decision-making capacities in human resources departments and for labor relations, where AI is being used to sort through applications and resumes, as well as evaluate work and make work assignments based on that evaluation, and all kinds of other things in between. So there's privacy concerns there, as well as making sure bias is not built into the systems, whether on purpose or not, and concerns along those lines that it's just used. It should be a tool, not a replacement for the things we're trying to do in delivering services. So I'll stop there. There's a lot more to talk about, obviously, but I know Chris has some other things to add, particularly on government.
Thank you. So as has been stated, the AI that's coming out right now is probably the first of the disruptive technologies we've seen come out that impact the workforce from across the board. You're saying blue collar to white collar. And that's backed up by multiple research that I've seen on that. we need to make sure that as a tool, it is kept and there's accountability for the decisions that are made. It can't be the decision maker, although there is great opportunity for it improving decision making. Improving automation to the point that it can help speed up processes. In New York State, I know we have such a hit to the workforce over the last few years that right now we're primarily looking at it to cover the gaps. We have units where we had 12 or 20 people 4 years ago, and now we're down to 1 or 2 people covering the same workload, and the workload is increasing. So it's more of looking at reorganization than it is necessarily replacing jobs. But at the same time, we have to be prepared to reskill and upskill the workforce. So it was mentioned 50% of the people in the next 3 years. With AI technologies, in most computer technologies, you're looking at a 6-month turnover on technology and the need for reskilling. Mobile development, AI technologies, all the stuff that's coming out now, you're looking at 3 months max. So it's a continual, you can no longer hire somebody with training and expect them to retire with the same skill set. Training and education have to be a continual part of that. So we need to focus on the reskilling of the workforce, identifying where people can find new roles so we don't lose that institutional knowledge by losing the workers, and make sure we have an inventory and a knowledge of what systems are out there and that there's accountability for the decisions that are made.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
And then just going to turn it to the folks who are on. Oh my gosh, Grace, apologies.
Okay.
Grace, and then the folks, actually, yes, yeah, let's start with Grace and then we can go Pamela and Andrew. Yeah.
Thank you, Senator Gonzalez, for having us all here today. And it's really great to have such a diverse panel here from all different parts of labor and technology. I think it's really important, as everyone said, to build in checks and balances to technology and make sure that we're protecting workers, we're protecting people. And I also agree with Chris that we really need to be focused on the education piece of the workforce. Just me personally, I said when ChatGPT first came out, the first thought I have in my head for my 3 young daughters is, what job are they going to have what are they going to grow up to be if we have computers writing things and doing things in this economy. And so, but that is a concern that we should have for our entire community and society. I also represent 18,000 public housing residents who already lack the same economic opportunities as many New Yorkers. And I think a lot about how are we going to invest in the educational system to be able to develop workers in an ever-evolving technological society. So I think those are things that we need to be thinking about in terms of how we are investing into different parts of government and in public sector and public education to be able to prepare people for what's to come.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And then I just in the order that I'm seeing folks, Pamela and then Andrew.
Yeah. Everyone, thank you so much for having me. So our team focuses on a couple of different areas of sort of this economic impacts research problem. And so one of the primary ones is how do we sort of think about making transitions kind to workers generally? I think that we all know that there's some sort of change coming in work. And so that includes both how AI can be used to sort of help with some of the hard skills that come with navigating job transitions, from writing resumes to skill development and education, as well as some of the sort of software skills and things like finding meaning and identity outside of work and thinking about how AI can be deployed in these different places. We're also, I think, very interested in the question of how to sort of think about some of the sort of policy mechanisms to respond to potential long-term impacts of some of these systems. So generally, we think that kind of risk of over-preparing for certain kinds of risks to the workforce are probably lower than the risk of under-preparing, and trying to better understand what policy mechanisms exist and how they might play out, given sort of different potential directions the technology could take. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm not going to repeat everything that I agree with that everyone said, but I will say that this is the largest wave of technological innovation that human beings have ever experienced. It's bigger than the industrial age. It's bigger than the invention of the internet. The closest analogy I can come to is the invention of fire.
Yeah.
And the challenge we have is that we're gonna go from a 40-hour work week essentially to a 20-hour work week in a couple of decades. If you think about the industrial age and the agricultural age, it took about 100 years to get from a 16-hour workday to a 40-hour work week. And there were all kinds of benefits that accrued to society when we got to a 40-hour work week: soccer practice, going on vacation, etc. But I don't know of any political, social, or economic or educational institutions that are prepared for the speed at which this wave is coming. And so I think thank you very much for inviting me, but I was going to make one suggestion at the very beginning is that the first thing we have to do is to figure out how to mitigate fear. There's so much fear among legislators, policymakers, and the public around this technology. We need to figure out how to train the people in order to train the machines, and not worry about the machines on their own. So that's the reason why I'm very grateful for you guys to have invited me into this conversation to continue, because I think it's an extremely, extremely important one. The digital divide just got worse, and if we don't move quickly, it's going to turn into a pandemic of massive impact.
Thank you so much, Andrew. So a lot to unpack. I feel like from so many of the themes, each of these could be a hearing, its own session. I think, of course, this is a first conversation, certainly not the last conversation, but just to summarize, I'm hearing themes of workforce transformation, the need for workforce development, concerns around privacy and data, the relationship, like AI labor relationships, and really, again, an emphasis on training, the need to upskill and reskill, prepare for a rapidly, within the next few months or next few years, changing workforce. And then a lot of questions around checks and balances and policy mechanisms. And so I guess with that, one of the first questions I had is, whether you are an AI doomer who's really, worried about what the future looks like, or an AI zoomer who just wants to throw AI at everything and just move really quickly, which, move fast, break things, I think is the spirit of Silicon Valley. I think good planning always brings us to a productive place. So good planning also comes from relationships, comes from working together. And one of the first questions I had was, what the relationship between the legislature, the private sector, labor should look like as we work together to answer these questions, and how you all have been kind of viewing that question.
I would tell you just the doomer zoomer part of the conversation is actually what is alienating and creating fear.
Yeah.
So we do a tremendous amount of work here in New York State and in California. And so I think the part of the conversation that we have to have is actually one that is a little bit more clear-eyed about not what's on the horizon, but the 1.1 billion jobs globally who have already transitioned to already think about this. And I think if we are to just say the transformation's underway, it's not coming, it's here, right? And then as we look at our roles, how do we create a little bit more collaboration and focus in on it? I think the challenge for labor is that right now, for perspective, we have high interest rates, right? That is making human labor and capital actually more expensive. We have the introduction of these new tools and a drive towards efficiency. And I would tell you, and I think we hold the belief that if we are to focus on efficiency, you will see an acceleration of job loss faster than we've ever seen, to Andrew's point. Whereas as a focus towards more of a resilient kind of economic future, which is very different, right? Which says that there's a reward for adaptivity, both on the business side as well as at the individual labor side. Then I think that we can have, a much more productive conversation in terms of the solutions that we need to put in place amongst all of us around the table.
Also, forgot to make a note. So we are panelists online, and so folks are
Yes,
like,
forgive us
you know,
if it's after
attendees.
the one.
So yeah, we had a note. I'm just looking at the camera while we're speaking for some of us who are in the room, and then just speaking up a little so that folks online can hear. Yeah.
All good.
Then any
All good.
other? Yeah, thank you so much. Any other direct responses? Again, happy to make this more of a conversation.
I'll
Yeah.
respond like this,
Yeah.
the National AFL-CIO has begun that process of relationship building, and they've actually partnered with Microsoft. There's a labor peace agreement, and there's a collaboration on training and access for members of the AFL-CIO to get Microsoft's training. That's something that's brand new, and we're working on that. But in answer to your question, those are the type of relationships that need to happen. It's about responsible development and use and applications, and building on training. So I think our opinion is that together, if there's public-private type partnerships like this, working with government to develop training centers and other types of development where we all have a role, labor, the government, and the development. That's going to be.
And I would say non-traditional, and I would purport is like today we're very focused on our universities. And the reality is that so many people do not have access to those universities. And so that puts up an enormous barrier for a lot of people, particularly in lower income neighborhoods within New York and then within upstate as well.
Forgive my back's not to you. I'm
That's okay.
following direction, but I'm speaking to you too.
Okay, great.
I agree, but I also think though that government has a really significant role to play here too, because our responsibility is to protect the people that we represent, right? And for us, it's the residents and the workers in New York State. And so, I think it's incumbent upon us to have some really tough conversations while the private sector and labor are also working out their relationship and how to move forward. From my perspective, it feels like we need to step in further to maybe put some parameters in place, not to stifle innovation by any means, but to really protect folks. And then we can always reel that back as we kind of get further into the discussion and the partnerships and relationships are put in place. The last thing I think we want from a government side is to know that things are happening, to sit back and say everyone can figure it out. And by that time, we've displaced hundreds of thousands, millions of people, right? We can always loosen things and make it easier to kind of push out technology as it makes sense for the broader job market. So I think from a government side, the relationships and the conversations are critical. And then also it's on us to have those tough conversations, to maybe do the uncomfortable things first to be able to then evolve as we go forward.
At a macro scale, one of the things that we absolutely need to be thinking about and considering are departments of what we call transition. And this is actually something we've talked with both the public and private sector and this is actually beginning to identify these sectors, right? That are I'd say if you look at, it's not going to be just at the individual, but there's whole industries that will no longer exist in about 2 years.
Yeah.
So as we look at that, there's, I think, an opportunity for government to play in terms of developing departments of transition that bring multiple parties around the table to begin identifying what are those industries, and then what does that transition plan start to look like?
Yeah, and go ahead.
I got a couple, yeah.
Well, I want to speak to what Joanna was saying about education. We really need to make sure that it's not just at four-year universities where education for AI is happening, that our community colleges are getting funded with technology programs that help people transition and get the job skills they need. And also there are a lot of non-traditional educational programs where it's, 6 weeks, 6 months kind of types of technology training that people can get to really get up and going. And also it's not just about like the book learning, but it's really about teaching, technical skills that they can use in the workforce, encouraging apprenticeship programs and those types of things that will really help move people from one industry to the next and be ready for this technology change.
Yeah, I was going to say more so than any of the technologies that we've tried implementing in the past, we really have to look at the ecosystem of everything that's happening. You know, we can't let private sector take the lead and then follow. Government can't throw on the privacy and advocacy rules without conferring. This really has to be a joint effort, which is why activities like this are so great. But we do need to address the fear of AI versus the reality of AI. We've all watched Terminator and other movies, and you know that's usually the first thing that comes to mind when in reality, you know, if they can get the robot hand to pour the glass of water without breaking the glass, they're happy. You know, but because of the speed of this technology and the impact that it can have, this has to be everybody moving forward with each other and not looking back to see who fell behind you. So we need to look at the education. You know, the certificate programs, as were mentioned, you know, they usually fall into two categories. You've got the day trainings or the, you know, the general knowledge certificates, but you do have these in-depth, you know, 6 weeks, 6 months that cover as much or if not more than a 4-credit university course. And we have to change our education system and our acknowledgement of that education to encourage that. You know, we have people coming out of out of community colleges and out of high school now with exactly the skills we need. You know, they're not going to come out perfect. Nobody graduates even a 4-year university with the tools, the techniques, the understanding of policy and the understanding of government necessary to do all this. They come out with maybe 1 or 2 of those, and businesses and the government has always had to train its workforce beyond that and we need to engage in more of that. You know, but to do that, we need the data. We need to talk to each other. You know, things like Centers Loading Act and a few other things. We need the inventory of the systems. We need to know what's out there, and we need to make sure that they're responsibly implemented.
I think
I have a question for Pamela, actually. Since we're
I
talking
think
about.
there are a couple. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, Pamela or Andrew, do you guys have comments online? Nope.
It sounded like Andrew had a question for me.
Question for Pamela. Yeah.
I was going to ask Pamela, you mentioned some. Yeah, I do, Pamela. I'm sorry, I know it's connection may be a little unstable, so I'm going to actually turn off my. You mentioned some data that you have been your OpenAI and others have been looking at. How much of that is public and shared? You know, to the issue of getting policymakers, legislative leaders to understand the shifting economy and the shifting. We need to expose that data publicly as much as possible.
Yes, we put out a paper last year.
What's really happening.
We put out a paper last year that gives kind of our best forecast for how this specific paradigm of large language models might impact the workforce, focused on the US labor market. And we're sort of regularly kind of revisiting those forecasts and updating them. One important thing is that we aren't currently good at kind of understanding specific models capabilities, let alone impact, which is kind of like a few steps removed from that. So that depends on trust. It depends on skills of workers actually sort of using those systems, depends on adoption and then choices given that adoption. So we're sort of thinking more in this work about if the sort of technology is wrapped in something like ChatGPT versus an API, for instance. And I'm happy to share that data with you all as well.
Yeah, and then does that data get essentially peer reviewed or, you know, looked at it? Is there some, I'm sure there isn't yet, but there maybe should be some sort of trade organization that represents all AI developing companies to share basic data around projections on impact on workforce, et cetera, because it could be based on the parameters you just mentioned. It could be subjective to your business needs as opposed to others. I'm just curious.
So the work is co-authored with independent academics, and then it's gone through academic peer review. So our team's focus was really producing robust research on what we actually think is going to happen. I think there's now a sort of question of how we actually work with labor to kind of validate some of what we think might happen and understand better how these kind of forecasts of exposure or relevance to a particular occupation actually play out in terms of impact. And so we're very excited about potential partnerships in that space. And then also better understanding transition. So what we know, so in this work, we sort of look at the percentage of tasks associated with a given occupation that are kind of relevant or related to the skills of large language models specifically. That misses a bunch of the story, right? Most workers are not like going about, task 1, task 2, task 3. There's a lot of communication that happens between people on the job. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that comes into actually sort of successfully performing a task. And there's a lot of trade-offs that come with different ways that technology can be introduced within like the sort of larger set of work that folks are doing. And so one thing we're sort of eager to understand and work with labor to understand is how much kind of relevance score can an occupation actually absorb? So how should we think about the difference of the technology can sort of do 10% of my role, but that doesn't actually have a meaningful impact on either productivity or, my hours versus 90% of my role. And that really sort of potentially changing how my manager is thinking about my role and the work that I'm doing. So there's a lot left to do.
Go for it. I think so thank you, Andrew, for the question and Pamela for the explanation. I think that's like a perfect segue, both between that and the question that we've gotten from a viewer. I don't know if someone wants to read that question because then I'll maybe tie together, or I can read it. So the question asks us to speak to the importance of regulating the use of AI in the private sector in addition to the public sector. And for example, New York City's AI law versus Senator Hoylman's BOT Act or other state efforts. And so a bill that we actually introduced today, the two of us, myself and Senator Gonzalez, introduced this morning, I think speaks a bit, Pamela, to what you were talking about, in the beginning of my comments, talking about not in necessarily a doomsday effort, although a little bit of a doomsday effort, about kind of creating an oligarchical society, right? If we are using AI and technology that will effectively eliminate the entry level jobs, middle management jobs, even some senior management jobs, effectively what you'll have left, and being a little extreme, but not necessarily, is boards and C-suite executives who are managing the AI to do the rest of the work. And if that's the case, how do you then, as a young person or a new person entering a job market, how do you get that C-suite job? How do you get that senior job? You can't work your way up in the way that we have historically been able to do that. So who takes those jobs? Family members of the folks who are currently in those jobs, friends of people who are currently in those jobs, right? That is a real scenario, maybe not necessarily the one that's going to happen, but a scenario, a possibility. And so carving out that space where technology, AI can help maybe someone be efficient, but doesn't actually impact their whole job and turn that into automation is critically important. So the bill that we introduced today does two things. One, it would require private companies, speaking on the private sector, private companies with 100 employees or more to, if they want to use AI in a big capacity, to do an impact assessment and report to the Department of Labor what they're planning to use that AI for, how many employees they would possibly displace, the types of algorithms they would use, the type of data mining they would use, all those kinds of things. Report that to DOL because we need, as we're talking about, the data to understand the scope and the impact. The second part of the bill says that any company that plans to use AI to displace 15 or more employees would have their corporate tax rate increase by 2%. And additionally, if they're using data mining at an extreme level, would increase by 2%. And then that money that's the increase that those companies are paying by displacing 15 or more employees doesn't just go to the general fund, it goes directly into either unemployment and workforce retraining programs for all the things that we talked about here, making sure that if we are displacing employees, that there is a pathway for folks to get the education and the training they need for the next set of jobs, possibly utilizing AI or something else that may be more protected from that space. So, I think, thank you for the segue, because I think this bill is a step in the direction of trying to find that balance, especially as what we were saying from the beginning of having to have those tough conversations, right? There may be a lot of companies that think that might be an overreach on what they can and can't do, but the importance for us as government is to put protections in place now to protect folks while we figure out what the landscape should look like. And again, we can always iterate that as we go forward, but we don't want to look backwards and say we should have done more when we saw this coming, and especially for the short time frame that we know we have.
Yeah.
One question I have, and this is just to open up the conversation to everybody also, I want to make sure I'm doing this right, is that in that though, and I think that's important, but I think we also need to address middle-sized companies, as well as there are small companies that are under 100. And I ponder whether 15, right, is the right ratio. That would be a question that I've got, is how do we come to the right ratio on that, and potentially look at percentages, because those displacements are actually happening right now. We saw a 10% cut in the last quarter within just technology sector jobs, where this is already being dog-fooded. Forgive me for those not in the industry. Dog fooding means we're utilizing the AI on our own workforce, or meaning utilizing tools, right? Efficiency tools on our own workforce to see whether or not they work, right? So we tend, if you look at the technology sector who says we build this technology, you generally apply it to your own workforce first. And so one starts to think a little bit about, you're seeing this displacement happen already in companies that are smaller also, yes, large Microsoft, right, companies like that, but you're also seeing it in 100 people companies, in 50-person companies. So when we look at that, I think there's almost a need to start to think about this in a way that has a little bit more of a balance, that it isn't just maybe a penalty to the large company, right? But that there is ramifications all down the line.
Yeah.
Because what we're going to see, right, what the future holds is actually smaller companies. There might be a lot more of them, but you're going to see a lot more smaller entities.
Right. I think and I'm sorry, then I'll move, but I think for you're totally right. And I think we recognize that this technology is being utilized at every size company, the 1-person company to the multi-thousand person company. We wanted to introduce the bill to have the discussion on where that should be with experts. But 2, starting at that higher level so as not to necessarily hurt the very, very small companies that may not hire a full-time person, but need some of that extra, if you're going to automate some bookkeeping or something like that. But there is definitely some work I think we could do, totally more work to do in the middle space.
Yeah.
I think that's a perfect segue. And I was actually going to turn it over to our labor partners, because we have private sector, regulators at the table, but that's why we need to make sure workers' voices are at the table. So curious what you're hearing and experiencing in your.
Well, first of all, we support very much what you're proposing, Senator. There has to be a process in place, and you're coming at it from looking at the overall workforce and impact on the workforce and putting some teeth and enforcement into it as well. I'll go a step further. One of the questions that was asked there before, the difference between the New York City law and Senator Hoylman put in a bill on the BOT Act, that comes at the workforce from a little bit of a different angle than you're tackling, a different problem anyway, which is the human resources and labor relations process. And it does a number of things in that space. I'll say this, I don't want to criticize New York City or the laws or anything, but I don't think these type of discussions happened before that was passed. Because one of the criticisms about that from employers and labor is a lack of clarity on what it means and a lack of enforcement and the ability to do that. So again, kudos for having this discussion, because it's not going to be easy. So that's something we should take a look at, the labor relations process and the BOT Act. And then finally, and Chris, you touched on it and you touched on it earlier, and I think you have a perfect bill to address government's role in AI. The first thing government needs to do is get a grasp on how it itself is using AI.
Yeah.
We haven't gotten quite an analysis of that, and state government's using it. We know counties and cities are using it, not just for direct services, but for eligibility determinations for programs like Medicaid or what have you. And if you keep in mind, these systems all have to talk to each other, the state and the counties and the Department of Health and, all these counties, they have to also interact with hospitals and private organizations. So as this gets developed and as different vendors that develop AI sell to government, we need a grasp on, is it going to work in the macro? Is it going to work in between the state? And is it going to protect the citizens who need to utilize these services? So we want to start with that one as well.
I don't know, I just want to do a little progressive stack and then also check if Andrew and Pamela have responses, but yes, yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, to continue that on, when we're looking at the workforce and we're, decision making, we have to make sure that we understand how the technologies are working, because bias is a real problem in these systems. We've already seen how systems like Compass, that's used by docs, impacts decision making by the court system. We have to look at the data that's behind these systems. Okay, it's not just the tool itself. When we're researching these systems, are we using open AI? Are we using public data sets? Are we using sets where we can't guarantee the integrity, where multiple people and organizations and entities can modify, or are we using internal data sets? Are we doing something maybe for an agency that has a set laws or codes, and we're implementing a search on those where we can pre-train it? We know what the data in is, we know what the data out is going to be. We have to distinguish and not make the screws too tight to prevent the efficiencies that we can gain in that way. But we have to definitely look at the biases in the system and where the data is and where the control and integrity of that data is.
Yeah, I do want to add a note too for folks, when we as the Intern and Technology Committee started tackling this issue, we acknowledged that charity starts right at home. So the first thing we regulated around was AI in elections. And we passed the FAIR Act through the budget to make sure that we were maintaining clear standards for use in elections, but also ensuring that we were, protecting our democracy essentially by combating the large or high level of misinformation we're already seeing and potentially will continue to see with the use of generative AI, right? So it starts with, again, fortifying our democracy. And then we introduced, to Mike's point, the Loading Act to make sure that if we're, again, going to turn it to the private sector and say, hey, we want to have clear standards, we're also going to hold ourselves to that standard. And we're going to look at how we're using it, when we're using it, and also maintain some fundamental rights, like the right to know as a citizen that any information you're receiving from a government source is accurate, right? And we saw that actually break down with the example of the My City chatbot, where, New York City implemented a large language model based chatbot, and it started prompting people to break the law, right? That is not good for our government. It's not good for our citizens. It's also not good for our democracy, and doesn't build that trust. So those are two of our first bills. But as we do that, that's why we're really looking at the impacts now of economy and workforce, because we have a much larger problem at hand between now public sector, private sector, to the question that we had before and what the difference is. So just with that, we've heard a lot about the need for upskilling, for training, whether it's our public sector employees, private sector employees. Curious if that's already happening for jobs that have been affected by AI, what that looks like. And then two, what isn't happening that we would like to see, so that we have also clear takeaways for folks who are here or in the audience. And then we can also start taking some questions from the chat. But I know I posed a big question here. I do see two hands from our virtual guests. So I'm going to go Andrew and then
Pamela, you go first.
Open up here. Yeah. Or Pamela, if you want to go. I think Andrew turned it to you. Yeah.
I'm sorry, did you say me?
Sorry, guys. Yeah.
My connection's a little unstable, so I turned off the video. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
So real quick, so I can give some room for Pamela to say something. Empire AI was just added to the budget, as you all know, which is to build an infrastructure for state universities and others to be able to take advantage of this AI revolution. $250 million, I think, has been allocated. We need another $250 million to fund the education process, not just of the public, to be honest, but actually policy leaders, teachers, government officials, There's so much misunderstanding about this technology and what it can do and how it can be applied. Our first order of business is to get our peers educated. And Senator Hinchey, I really applaud the bill that you've presented because it's a catalyst for a conversation about whether or not this technology shifts power from the few to the many or the many to the few. And I think we're all afraid that it's shifting power from the many to the few. And so unless we go through a parallel education process among essentially the people responsible at institutions for the public good, we're going to fail in adapting any of the existing systems that are not moving fast enough. Workforce development programs are not moving fast enough for this. Every workforce development organization, digital one that's teaching code right now, is teaching an obsolete skill.
Yeah.
So simultaneous to this, there needs to be a push for more funding for an education program for the public sector and a public interest sector.
Here. Times 10, Andrew. So one of the areas that I'd like to add to that, and Pamela, and I'd love to get your perspective as well. I mean, I think fundamentally, we have some fundamental shifts. We actually work within the schools, and our effort has been with teachers first, because inevitably we've got to train the trainers. And one of the things that we have found, right, is we talk a lot about that. I think they're amongst the realization that the work has already changed, right? Their student body are already utilizing the tools. And what we actually need to fundamentally do is actually have a simultaneous conversation with regard to training the trainers, but also whether or not the existing mechanisms within our education systems are the answer. Because I'm not completely sure that we have the appropriate mechanisms to do the necessary training. And let me give an example around this, which was the ability to, one question was, the ability to identify whether or not somebody had brought in an essay utilizing generative AI. And I speak more generally because I know OpenAI is in the room, but there are lots of players in this place. There's over 150 players within the LLM space alone. And that LLMs only, by the way, are about 50% of the progress that we're making in the space. But if we just go back to that arena, the answer to that was actually, it begged a really, I think, more philosophical question amongst the educators, which I thought was the important one, which is the essay the right mechanism to be a measure of mastery? And the answer became perhaps not. So I think that along with the education system, we should also be looking at the mechanisms by which we say this is the kind of education that those folks need. And I think that's an important one. The one thing that you touched on, I think, was the importance of understanding the data piece of this.
Yes.
One thing that I would love to be able to see, I haven't had an opportunity to read what you've just put in front of us, but it's corpus sourcing. It is a minimum standard. Corpus sourcing means that we as private companies have to share the data that is actually our models are being trained on, or at least the types of data. And how much of the constituency does that represent in the form of some kind of confidence scoring? And so for those of us in the field of AI, these are two low-hanging pieces of fruit. So that's corpus sourcing, right? Where's the data come from? How is it making the decisions? And the other part around this is very specifically, how much of that data, so easy math question to answer for some, not for everybody at the table, but some of us who work in the field, say what is representative 95% of the constituency, right? And where is your plus or minus on those kinds of decisions, be it in healthcare, housing, right, journalism. I think if you look at some of those criminal justice, where I think these things are already being applied, and low-hanging fruit for your bill.
I think Pamela had a hand online from before, so I just want to make sure we give you some space.
Chris, yeah. I'm excited to dig into this bill because I think it sounds really exciting. I think one of the big things I'm excited about this space is sort of consumer products like ChatGPT, where folks was up to the worker or the consumer to decide when and how they're using it in their work. And this learning is kind of potentially embedded in the system itself, and they sort of stay in control of the system and how it's used. I also think we kind of just generally need to better understand differential impacts, who's actually using these systems. If we do think they're delivering value, how do we make sure that more folks have access and are reaching for them where they would be useful? And are like that generally workers are kind of, I'm going to go through things quickly, but are kind of generally receiving equal training in how they're using these. I think one other thing that's really interesting to us is sort of how we create automatic stabilizers or trigger conditions around how these technologies are rolled out. So whether that's based on the results of some kind of impact assessment or impact forecast, or sort of directly tied to displacement, I think is an area that needs a lot more work. And it is of interest to us. I'd love to talk about it more another time. I think one big question is how we continue to allow, firms of 15 to compete against, a startup that's maybe one developer kind of doing the work of 15 people, and creating, systems that are robust to both models or allow for that creation. And then I think sorry, I'm going through a few things kind of quickly, but I think I generally also just think having more folks use the system is the way to understand them. It's like the best education we've been able to land. And so I think that includes policymakers potentially, and there's a couple of different applications that are pretty exciting to us. So the state of Minnesota has been using ChatGPT for translation, and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has been using it to kind of make outdated policy language more accessible to members of the public. So I think these there are kind of small things that are don't necessarily feel generative in nature, right? These can still be sort of static outputs that folks are engaging with, but that are still taking advantage of the technology and rolling it out in ways that are useful for the public today. So yeah, I think those were all my little notes on the side, but
that's great.
I'll just dovetail on that because your question was, I think, correct. It's a good question. Is there enough being done on displacement? There's not. I mean, the Writers Guild, SAG-AFTRA had to go on strike. The single largest issue being how is the future of AI going to impact those jobs moving forward? I think you're going to start seeing a lot more of that from other sectors and other unions. So the good news there from our perspective, where there's a labor union, there is some avenues and mechanisms you can use. But if you're not organized, you don't have the right to strike necessarily and that kind of voice. So we're going to hopefully keep building on that and getting in there. But therein is government's role to make sure, we have the WARN Act for the private sector when there are job losses. Maybe we need to build AI in the intentions of the
and specifically,
use that.
right. And specifically, I think this is the area, particularly, let's use the Writers Guild as a really good example, who, for what it's worth, we just kind of, I was an advisor to some of them. And I will tell you, there was a little bit of a punt down just a couple of more years away. And the punt it becomes is that what we need, particularly in this case, is an extension of the copyright law to take care of things like tone of voice, right? If a voice biomarker is actually specific to you as an individual, right? How do we begin to protect that as IP? And those are, I think, really important things, but we need laws in place to be able for labor to actually be able to say, well, that, this law would be protected underneath there, and you'd be able to monetize your tone of voice, and a large language model wouldn't be able to scoop that up without paying you for it.
Yeah. And Andrew referred to the 250 million AI consortium. That's great. That's a good thing for the state to be involved with, but also the state should there should be a transparent process for the state to know what is being developed there. What are the potential uses for it? Will it impact, before it's implemented or used elsewhere? So I'll stop there. Chris.
Yeah, one of the things I want to make sure that was emphasized in this discussion is we have to take a serious look at the investment into the activities we've been talking about. We've hit all the great points today, but like Andrew pointed out, $250 million for Empire AI is great, but if you don't upskill the educational workforce and the peers to be able to implement that, you're going to fall short. We need similar investment in the rest of government. I'm in the IT agency, bit of a geek, but if we don't get our hands on the technology and be able to break it and test it and run it through its courses, we won't be prepared to not only implement it, but if other companies come in with off-the-shelf products or solutions, how do we gauge whether or not they have value? So we need to invest in the workforce, not only in training, but in hardware, software, things like that. One of the things when I graduated University of Albany, and one of their drives during the time was, they teach at a general level mostly because they want the code, the tools change over time. Okay, they wanted people to be able to adapt, and and we need that focus. We need people. I heard a phrase earlier that always makes me cringe. Coding is obsolete. Well, no, the coding that was done 20 years ago is obsolete. The coding that was done 3 years ago is obsolete. But coding is just a tool, which is why you train for being a programmer or developer, and you adapt to the new technologies out there. You still have to understand the code. You still have to know because there are great opportunities we've seen for developers where the AIs can generate base code and everything at a really quick rate. Cutting one test my team did took us 2 weeks down to about 3 hours. But then you have to go in and verify it, validate it, test it. And if you don't have that knowledge, then you're falling short on that. So investment into the workforce is necessary.
Yeah. I know we're pretty much at time. So I just, again, want to thank you all so much and then provide some closing comments. There's a lot of work to get done. I think for the folks viewing, there's a question around like, where are we going? How are we supporting New Yorkers, UBI, otherwise? These are the questions. These are why we need to have these conversations, the questions we're trying to answer. I think the analogy I use that really resonates with just like most New Yorkers who may or may not have been thinking about this a lot is the analogy of a car, right? AI or generative AI is like a car. It's really exciting. It can get us to some really cool and new places. But we want to make sure that it's built correctly. There are brakes, it's safe. And as a government, right, we haven't built the roads yet. We haven't built the stop signs. We haven't built the streetlights or regulations. And so there's just so much work that needs to be done. And of course, we want to make sure that the workers that are building the car and the street signs and the roads are being treated fairly and equitably, and the public that enjoys the street finds it safe, right? It's literally, it's going to take all of us to be active and vocal on this. So again, first of many conversations. Thank you all so much for joining. Thank you to the folks online as well, Pamela and Andrew.
Thank you for your leadership, Kristen. Thank you so much.
Recording out. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
All right, bye.